a 38-year-old man commanding absolute power in American television, a companion completely devoid of independent adult experience, the harmless comedic persona that brought comfort to millions of families, functioned as a flawless deflection tool. To this day, this severely imbalanced dynamic remains buried beneath $100 million contracts and corporate leverage. This is the story of Jerry Seinfeld. How did the Hollywood machinery operate to completely sanitize this reality, rendering one man entirely untouchable? The year was 1993. America was navigating the cultural hangover of the late 20th century. Audiences were exhausted by heavy political discourse and moralizing family sitcoms. They desperately craved a spiritual refuge in their entertainment. Born in 1954 in Brooklyn, carrying Hungarian and Syrian heritage, Jerry Seinfeld recognized this exact market demand. Even after spending a brief period at age 16 volunteering on a collective agricultural kibbutz in Israel, his singular focus remained fixed on the stage. He treated observational comedy as a strict, almost mathematical science. He avoided drugs. He completely ignored politics. He refused to use profanity. His entire act was built on dissecting the trivial annoyances of daily life. Starting in obscure, poorly lit comedy clubs at age 21, he meticulously constructed an absolutely safe, sterile persona. The audience wanted a harmless, witty neighbor, and he systematically transformed himself into exactly that product. His rise from the bottom of the comedy circuit to the absolute peak of television was secured by perfectly satisfying the crowd's appetite for artificial peace. The image he projected was a masterpiece of deflection. By focusing his comedic lens entirely on missing socks, cereal boxes, and bad drivers, he built an impenetrable shield of perceived innocence. The public consciously made a decision. A man obsessing over the minutia of a grocery store line could not possibly harbor profoundly unbalanced intentions. This brand of clean, detached irony made him the most valuable commodity in the entertainment industry. Advertisers felt completely secure attaching their billion-dollar brands to his face. Families gathered around the television every Thursday night, completely unaware that the man making them laugh was operating under a drastically different set of personal rules. Behind this carefully curated public face, a deep illusion of total control had taken root. In 1976, after being abruptly fired from the sitcom Benson without a single word of warning, the young comedian learned a harsh, unforgettable industry truth. Actors are merely disposable pawns in a corporate game. He decided right then to build his own board. He pivoted aggressively back to the stand-up circuit. A crucial open mic breakthrough in 1976 eventually paved the way for a career-defining appearance on HBO, setting the foundation for his own empire. His historic meeting with Larry David in 1975 birthed a show famously pitched as being about nothing. Ratings eventually skyrocketed, defying all traditional broadcast logic. Advertising revenue flooded into the network like a tidal wave. He began to believe he was the sole, undisputed master of his own printing press. He handled hecklers at his stand-up shows with lethal, clinical patience, playing the role of a composed psychiatrist looking down on noisy, unstable patients. He maintained a facade of everyman humility through occasional unannounced sets at small local clubs, ensuring the press always had a narrative of the grounded artist who never forgot his roots. When a television show generates unprecedented billions for a network, its lead star ceases to be an independent human being. he morphs into a multinational corporation. Any blemish on his character directly threatens the livelihoods of thousands of people, spanning from high-level network executives in New York corner offices to the lowest-level camera operators on the studio floor in Los Angeles. The NBC system immediately wrapped him in a gilded, impenetrable cage. The executives accommodated every financial demand and ruthlessly smothered every potential public relations threat. His cultural cachet grew so immense that he routinely declined major studio projects and casually took meetings with President Bill Clinton, dictating his own operational terms to the entire industry. Absolute power inevitably begins to blur all moral boundaries. A man applauded by the entire nation, shielded by an army of lawyers and publicists, naturally begins to believe he exists entirely above the law and standard social norms. The stage was completely set for a massive collision between unchecked celebrity entitlement and civilian vulnerability. In May of 1993, this unchecked power manifested in broad daylight. Central Park is a sprawling public space, yet the interaction that took place there was incredibly precise. A multimillionaire television star at the absolute zenith of American culture intercepted Shoshana Lowenstein. She was a 17-year-old senior attending the Nightingale Bamford School. She lived with her parents, she had a high school curfew, she was preparing for her prom and final exams. He commanded a television empire that dictated the cultural conversation of an entire country. A 21-year age gap represents a massive, unbridgeable chasm in cognitive development, authority, and financial independence. A highly experienced Hollywood veteran was initiating a dynamic where he held absolute social and financial leverage over a high school senior. Far from a random spark of romance, despite what the subsequent media campaigns would labor intensely to project, this encounter represented a conscious maneuvering of a power dynamic heavily weighted in one direction. He possessed the wealth to buy silence, the fame to intimidate, and the media connections to rewrite reality. She possessed merely the naive awe of a teenager standing face to face with the most famous man on television. The initial stages of this interaction relied heavily on his carefully cultivated, harmless persona. If a notorious rock star or a known Hollywood bad boy had approached a high school senior in a public park, alarm bells would have immediately sounded. Because it was the famously clean cereal-eating comedian, the inherent danger of the situation was completely cloaked in celebrity charm. The machinery of the 1990s entertainment press functioned as a compliant partner in this dynamic. Before the democratization of information through the internet, a few powerful gatekeepers controlled exactly what the public knew. A star of this magnitude employed elite teams whose sole daily purpose was crisis management and narrative construction. They operated entirely on leverage. The network provided exclusive interviews, set visits, and access to a roster of A-list stars to compliant magazines and entertainment shows. In exchange, the press agreed to look the other way when the talent crossed ethical lines. When whispers of the 38-year-old man pursuing the 17-year-old high school student inevitably began to circulate in elite New York circles, the corporate machine did not panic. It coldly calculated the threat level. It began preparing the ground to frame a severe extreme power imbalance as a harmless, slightly eccentric love story. They were fully prepared to deploy millions of dollars in resources to ensure the golden goose remained completely unharmed, laying the groundwork that would soon detach a teenager from everything she knew. The transition from a quiet, deeply unbalanced encounter in Central Park to a highly publicized international spectacle did not happen overnight. It was preceded by a deliberate, calculated period of intense psychological influence, operating entirely within the shadows of his immense celebrity. Consider the logistical reality of this dynamic. Here was a 38-year-old man, the undisputed anchor of the NBC television network, commanding a schedule dictated by script readings, network executive meetings, national stand-up tours, and multi-million-dollar promotional campaigns. Yet, he systematically carved out the time to court a high school senior. The communications were heavily weighted with the inherent intimidation of his status. A teenager living under her parents' roof was suddenly receiving attention from a face she saw on magazine covers at every grocery store checkout line in America. This period of initial contact was crucial for establishing an overwhelming power dynamic. By the time the public or the press even caught a whisper of the relationship, the psychological groundwork had already been firmly laid, ensuring that when the storm of media attention finally broke, she would be completely reliant on him for protection and guidance. When the rumors finally breached the walls of elite New York social circles and landed on the desks of tabloid editors, the Hollywood public relations machinery executed a masterclass in narrative manipulation. The crisis management strategy was swift, unified, and ruthlessly effective. When directly confronted by the press regarding the severe age disparity and the ethical implications of pursuing a 17-year-old, his defensive posture was carefully constructed. By elite publicists, he issued a statement claiming he initially did not realize she was still in high school. This defense, upon any serious scrutiny, is entirely absurd. A man nearing his 40th birthday, engaging in prolonged conversation and courtship with a teenage girl, would inevitably encounter the realities of her daily life: high school curfews, college applications, prom preparations, and the fundamental lack of independent adult experience. The secondary line of defense deployed by his team was equally calculated to exploit legal loopholes while ignoring profound ethical questions. They aggressively pushed the narrative that they were merely friends and strictly waited until she celebrated her 18th birthday before officially dating. This is a classic deflection tactic utilized by powerful figures. It attempts to create a sanitized, legally permissible timeline, completely erasing the overwhelming nature of the emotional influence, the manipulation, and the psychological dependency that took place long before any candles were blown out on an 18th birthday cake. The most chilling aspect of this period was the absolute complicity of the mainstream media. In the early 1990s, the cultural vocabulary surrounding power dynamics, severe imbalances, and intense psychological influence was practically non-existent in the public sphere. The media apparatus did not possess or willfully chose to ignore the analytical tools necessary to dissect this relationship. Instead of launching investigative pieces into the severe imbalance of power, major publications actively softened the narrative. They branded it a quirky, unconventional romance. Instead of portraying a vulnerable teenager being isolated by a vastly older, powerful man, the media apparatus painted her as a remarkably lucky girl who had somehow managed to capture the heart of America's most eligible bachelor. This editorial framing was not accidental. It was a direct result of the leverage held by his television network and his massive publicity firm. Tabloid editors and entertainment journalists, knew that launching a moral crusade against the star of Thursday night television meant instant blacklisting. They would lose access to exclusive interviews, set visits, and the lucrative access that kept their own publications afloat. Therefore, the industry collectively agreed to look the other way, actively transforming a deeply concerning display of highly questionable ethical behavior into easily digestible romanticized tabloid fodder. The mechanical execution of her isolation began shortly after her high school graduation. Attempting to follow a normal trajectory for a young woman of her background, Shoshana initially enrolled at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. For a brief moment, geography provided a physical buffer, placing a continent between herself and the epicenter of the Hollywood machinery offered a fleeting chance at a normal collegiate existence. However, the gravitational pull of a billionaire television star is immense, and the psychological tether established during her senior year of high school proved too strong. The pressure to close the physical distance became the defining force in her life. She made the decision to transfer to the University of California, Los Angeles. This was the definitive turning point in the erosion of her independence. Driven less by academic ambition or desire for personal growth, this transfer served as a strategic relocation directly into his heavily fortified territory. By moving to Los Angeles, she effectively severed her daily connection to her natural support system, her high school friends, her family, and the familiar environment of the East Coast. She was unmoored, dropped directly into the treacherous waters of the entertainment capital, completely dependent on the man who had orchestrated her arrival. Once established in Los Angeles, the reality of her gilded cage became suffocatingly clear. She was a college student attempting to attend lectures, study for exams, and navigate the typical anxieties of higher education. Simultaneously, she was abruptly thrust into the role of an appendage to the reigning king of the entertainment industry. The power imbalance in their daily lives was staggering. He spent his days on the heavily guarded CBS Studio Center lot, surrounded by an army of writers, producers, and assistants whose sole professional purpose was to cater to his creative and personal needs. He was insulated, protected, and treated as an infallible deity. She, on the other hand, was entirely exposed. Her existence was reduced to waiting in his mansion, accompanying him to high-profile industry events, and walking silently beside him on red carpets. She was forced to navigate elite Hollywood social circles, interacting with executives and celebrities who viewed her primarily as a temporary, easily replaceable accessory to their most valuable asset. The 1990s paparazzi culture weaponized her vulnerability. Before the era of smartphones and social media, the paparazzi were a highly organized, physically aggressive syndicate. These were men wielding massive camera lenses, operating in aggressive packs, actively pursuing their targets. For a seasoned Hollywood veteran, the paparazzi were a manageable nuisance, a transactional annoyance built into the cost of extreme fame. He had security details, gated communities, and the experience to ignore their provocations. For an isolated teenager trying to attend college classes, it was relentless psychological pressure. Photographers camped outside her classrooms at UCLA. They followed her vehicle through the streets of Los Angeles. They documented her every movement, capturing her moments of visible terror and confusion. They shouted aggressive, humiliating questions to elicit a profitable reaction, knowing that a photograph of her crying or looking distressed would sell for thousands of dollars to the highest bidding tabloid. She was targeted precisely because she was the unprotected flank of a heavily guarded empire. A brutal double standard defined the public consumption of their lives. When he was interviewed, the press focused entirely on his genius. Journalists asked about his writing process, the astronomical ratings of his show, and his multi-million-dollar contract negotiations. He was afforded the dignity of an artist and a titan of industry. When the lens turned to her, she was aggressively reduced to a two-dimensional caricature. The media scrutinized her wardrobe choices, her physical appearance, and her fitness regimen. The tabloids debated her maturity level and her supposed intentions, engaging in a disturbing form of public scrutiny that practically accused a teenager of bewitching a fully grown man. They projected an image of a calculating young woman, entirely shielding him from any moral accountability. The public devoured these narratives, completely blind to the fact that they were participating in the public consumption and dismantling of a young woman's identity. Behind the locked doors of the studio executive suites, the silence was deafening. The corporate leaders at NBC and the production companies involved in the show were acutely aware of the situation. Yet, not a single executive intervened. There was no internal investigation, no moral reckoning, no quiet conversations cautioning the star about the optics or the ethics of his actions. Their singular obsessive concern was the Nielsen ratings. The show was a cultural phenomenon, printing money at an unprecedented rate, keeping the network dominant in the highly competitive Thursday night primetime slot. As long as the advertising rates continued to shatter records and the audience remained captivated by the sanitized humor on screen, his personal life was strictly protected by the network's formidable legal and public relations divisions. The executives operated under a cold, ruthless corporate logic. The value of the asset far outweighed the human cost of his personal conduct. They were not merely bystanders, they were active enablers, providing the financial and structural impunity that allowed the deeply unbalanced dynamic to continue unchecked. The long-term psychological toll of this environment was devastating. She was systematically stripped of the fundamental right to make normal youthful mistakes in private. Every misstep, every awkward outfit, every unguarded facial expression was captured, printed, and scrutinized by millions of strangers. She was forced into a state of premature defensive adulthood under the harshest spotlight imaginable. The developmental years that should have been spent discovering her own passions, forging her own identity, and building her own independent life were entirely overshadowed. She lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, knowing that any expression of dissatisfaction or rebellion could be weaponized against her by the very media machine that protected her partner. The realization slowly crystallized within her that her core identity was being actively erased, hollowed out, and permanently replaced by a singular degrading title. She was no longer an independent human being with a future. She was merely Jerry Seinfeld's teenage girlfriend, trapped in a narrative entirely controlled by the men who profited from her silent compliance. The year 1997 marked a definitive breaking point. 4 years had passed since that initial calculated encounter in Central Park. Shoshana Lonstein was no longer a 17-year-old high school senior dazzled by celebrity. She was 21 years old, approaching her graduation from the University of California, Los Angeles. The cognitive and developmental gap that had allowed the initial influence to take root was rapidly closing. Adulthood brings a brutal clarity, and for Shoshana, that clarity illuminated the exact dimensions of her isolation. The illusion of a glamorous Hollywood romance had entirely evaporated, replaced by the crushing reality of a completely overshadowed existence. She was staring down the barrel of her own future, and she recognized that remaining in this dynamic meant permanently sacrificing her autonomy. She would never be an independent professional. She would never be judged on her own merits. If she stayed, her obituary would forever be defined by the man she accompanied on red carpets. The intense environmental pressure had reached a critical threshold. Living alongside a billionaire television star is not merely a matter of sharing a physical space. It is an absolute surrender to their operational machinery. Her daily existence was dictated by his filming schedules, his promotional tours, and his relentless need for environmental control. She lived in a mansion that functioned more like a corporate headquarters than a home. The paparazzi presence had not diminished. It had metastasized. They were a constant, aggressive physical threat, waiting outside her classrooms, tracking her vehicle, and documenting her visible exhaustion. The profound isolation of being a young woman entirely cut off from a normal peer group began to exact a massive toll. She was surrounded by industry veterans, sycophants, and paid handlers whose sole loyalty was to the man signing their paychecks. In this deeply unbalanced ecosystem, she had no advocates. She had no one to tell her that this level of scrutiny and control was abnormal and highly irregular and exhausting. Initiating an exit strategy from a profoundly powerful man requires an immense, almost unimaginable level of psychological fortitude. Breaking up with a normal partner involves emotional pain. Breaking up with the anchor of the NBC television network involves dismantling a corporate arrangement. She was well aware of the risks. She knew that attempting to leave could trigger a massive retaliation from his media apparatus. The entertainment press, which had spent 4 years largely ignoring her discomfort to protect his image, could easily be weaponized to destroy her reputation. They could frame her as unstable, ungrateful, or calculating. She was stepping out of a heavily fortified, albeit highly restrictive fortress, and walking directly into a public minefield. Yet the primal instinct for survival ultimately overrides the fear of public humiliation. She made the definitive choice to sever the tie. She packed her belongings, abandoned the Los Angeles bubble, and booked a flight back to the East Coast. This unilateral act of independence starkly bypassed any standard mutual parting of ways. It was a desperate, successful attempt to reclaim her interrupted youth and reestablish her fundamental human agency. The immediate aftermath of her departure triggered a massive, highly coordinated response from the Hollywood public relations machinery. The crisis managers were instantly deployed. A breakup involving a major star is a highly volatile event, and when the relationship itself is built on a foundation of severe power imbalance, the risk of a public relations catastrophe is magnified tenfold. The PR strategy executed in May of 1997 was a masterclass in narrative neutralization. The objective was clear: protect the star at all costs while ensuring the departing woman did not become a sympathetic martyr. They could not explicitly attack her, as bullying a 21-year-old girl would shatter his carefully curated image of the harmless, witty everyman. Instead, they fed the tabloids a highly sanitized, deliberately boring narrative. The official story planted in the press was one of geographical fatigue and paparazzi exhaustion. The headlines uniformly declared that she simply missed her family in New York and could no longer handle the aggressive Los Angeles photographers. This framing was a brilliant, sinister piece of deflection. It completely erased the highly unequal origins of the relationship. It ignored the severe age gap, the intense psychological influence, and the stark reality of a man nearing his mid-40s, exercising significant leverage over a teenager. By blaming the paparazzi and homesickness, the PR team successfully shifted the entire burden of the failure onto external factors. The comedian was completely absolved of any moral responsibility. The press painted him as a slightly melancholic, understanding older bachelor who was simply unlucky in love. The media blindly accepted and amplified this corporate script. Not a single major publication used the breakup as an opportunity to retrospectively examine the ethics of a 38-year-old man waiting outside a high school for a teenager. The silence of the journalistic establishment was absolute. However, despite this successful initial containment, a looming existential threat remained for the comedian and his network. He was now a 43-year-old newly single billionaire who had just spent 4 highly publicized years with a young girl. The late 1990s media landscape was slowly beginning to shift. The public appetite for scandal was growing sharper, and the protective walls around major celebrities were starting to show microscopic cracks. His team recognized a fundamental law of crisis management. If you do not want the public looking at the skeletons in the closet, you must immediately set the house on fire. He needed a distraction of unprecedented magnitude. He needed a narrative so massive, so culturally significant, that it would completely swallow any lingering whispers about his personal life. The timing of what followed was not merely coincidental. It was the deployment of the ultimate narrative smokescreen. In late 1997, the executives at NBC were in a state of absolute desperation. Their flagship show, the cornerstone of their must-see TV Thursday night lineup, was approaching the end of its 9th season. It was generating billions of dollars in advertising revenue, syndication deals, and merchandise sales. The network approached their star with an offer that defied all historical precedent. They placed a contract on the table worth $110 million for a 10th season. This broke down to an astonishing $5 million per single episode. It was an offer designed to be completely irresistible. It was Warren Buffett-level wealth offered for 22 weeks of television production. The network executives were entirely confident. They believed, based on decades of industry experience, that no human being could walk away from that amount of guaranteed capital. They fundamentally misunderstood the stakes of the game their star was actively playing. He categorically refused the offer. In December of 1997, he publicly announced that the show would conclude at the end of its current season. He claimed he wanted to go out on top. He cited the Beatles and their strategic decision to disband before their cultural impact could dilute. He spoke eloquently to the press about artistic integrity, about respecting the audience, and about the necessity of leaving the stage while the crowd was still cheering. The execution of this announcement was flawless. The global media apparatus instantly consumed and regurgitated this narrative. The story of the $110 million refusal became an international sensation. It dominated news broadcasts, magazine covers, and water cooler conversations across the country. The strategic brilliance of this maneuver cannot be overstated. By dismantling his own money printing machine, he seized absolute control of the global conversation. He elevated himself from a highly successful sitcom star to the status of an untouchable tortured genius who placed his artistic legacy above unimaginable financial gain. He became a cultural martyr, and in the blinding glare of this massive public relations triumph, the shadows of his private life completely vanished. The public and the press instantly forgot about the 21-year-old girl who had just fled his Los Angeles mansion. They stopped analyzing his dating history. They stopped asking questions about power dynamics. The entire cultural focus shifted exclusively to mourning the impending loss of the greatest comedy series in television history. The termination of the series functioned precisely as intended. It buried the past under a mountain of collective grief and artistic praise. The final episode aired in May of 1998 to an audience of over 76 million viewers. It was a cultural event on par with a presidential election or a moon landing. The streets of major cities were noticeably empty as the nation gathered to watch the finale. The sheer volume of this collective attention served as the final impenetrable layer of concrete poured over his controversial actions. The PR machine had successfully utilized the death of a television show to permanently sanitize a highly scrutinized public figure. His team meticulously curated the definitive biographies, the retrospective documentaries, and the legacy interviews that followed. They ensured that the era of his life involving the high school student was either entirely omitted or reduced to a brief, inconsequential footnote. The historical record was officially rewritten. He had successfully navigated one of the most perilous public relations tightropes in modern entertainment history. He had exerted absolute control in a highly unequal dynamic, survived the inevitable collapse of that highly controversial arrangement, and manipulated the subsequent media fallout with surgical precision. He walked away with his reputation completely intact, his fortune secure, and his status as a cultural deity cemented forever. He possessed the freedom to move forward, entirely unbound by the consequences of his actions. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to. It had protected its most valuable asset, silenced the inconvenient voices, and presented a flawless, manufactured reality to a willing and gullible public. But the machinery of Hollywood rarely stops moving. While he retreated to a life of unimaginable luxury and carefully managed public appearances, the destructive habits ingrained by years of absolute unchecked power do not simply vanish. The belief that one is entirely exempt from the rules governing ordinary society is a dangerous, lingering toxin. And as he prepared to enter the next phase of his life, entirely confident in his invincibility, that exact toxic entitlement was about to place him directly in the center of an entirely new, deeply disturbing controversy. The lesson he learned was not caution or humility. The lesson he learned was that with enough money and leverage, he could take absolutely anything he wanted, regardless of the wreckage left in his wake. The psychological residue of absolute, unchecked power does not simply evaporate when a television show ceases production. When a man has spent nearly a decade insulated by billionaire network executives, shielded by elite public relations mercenaries, and universally adored by a global audience, the fundamental boundaries of acceptable human behavior become entirely distorted. He had successfully manipulated his way out of a highly precarious, deeply scrutinized relationship with a vastly younger companion, utilizing the termination of his sitcom as the ultimate smokescreen. He emerged not just unscathed, but historically lionized. By 2005, industry channels officially ranked him as the 12th greatest stand-up comedian of all time. This accolade permanently cemented his cultural immunity. The lesson ingrained in his psyche was profound and deeply dangerous. The rules of society simply do not apply to him. If he desired something, regardless of the emotional collateral damage inflicted upon others, he possessed the financial and cultural leverage to simply take it. This toxic entitlement manifested with breathtaking audacity merely months after the cameras stopped rolling on his historic television set. The public was about to witness a display of arrogance that confirmed the absolute worst suspicions about the profound lack of accountability hidden beneath his sterile, comedic persona. In August of 1998, inside the exclusive confines of the Reebok Sports Club on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, his gaze landed on a 26-year-old fashion publicist named Jessica Sklar. Under normal circumstances, an incredibly wealthy celebrity pursuing a publicist in New York City is standard tabloid fodder. However, the circumstances surrounding this specific pursuit were extraordinarily brazen. Jessica Sklar was not a single woman. She was a newlywed who had returned from a 3-week honeymoon in Italy just days prior to this encounter. She was legally married to Eric Nederlander, a prominent theatrical producer and heir to one of the most powerful Broadway entertainment families in the world. For a standard citizen, a freshly inked marriage certificate acts as a definitive boundary. For a man accustomed to the absolute capitulation of everyone around him, another man's marriage was merely a minor logistical inconvenience to be aggressively bypassed. He initiated a relentless pursuit. He deployed the full weight of his celebrity charm, his unimaginable wealth, and his status to dismantle a marriage that had barely begun. The ensuing fallout was a spectacular collision of old New York money and new Hollywood power. Eric Nederlander was humiliated on a global stage. The devastation inflicted upon him was profound and entirely unnecessary. He publicly stated that he was manipulated, misled, and completely blindsided by his new wife's sudden departure into the arms of the comedian. The callousness of the operation was staggering. A man's life was abruptly shattered simply because a billionaire pointed a finger and decided he wanted what belonged to someone else. When the press inevitably caught wind of the scandal, the comedian's reaction was entirely devoid of empathy or remorse. He exhibited the cold, detached arrogance of a monarch, swatting away a minor nuisance. He refused to acknowledge the wreckage he had caused. Furthermore, when his close friend, the notoriously outspoken radio host Howard Stern, dared to publicly question the morality of pursuing a woman immediately after her honeymoon, the comedian instantly severed the friendship. He demanded absolute loyalty and zero criticism. Anyone who dared to hold up a mirror to his destructive behavior was immediately excommunicated from his heavily fortified inner circle. To manage this new wave of intense scrutiny, the internal architecture of his empire required a massive structural reinforcement. The protection of the asset became a family business. The management of his entire professional and personal life was consolidated under the strict control of his sister, Carolyn Liebling. She assumed the role of the ultimate gatekeeper. She oversaw a sprawling team of lawyers, accountants, and publicists, constructing an impenetrable iron wall around his daily existence. She controlled all press access, ruthlessly negotiating the terms of every interview to ensure that journalists were legally barred from asking any questions regarding his highly debated past relationship or the highly controversial origins of his new marriage. Reporters were forced to sign strict agreements dictating the parameters of the conversation, effectively neutering the journalistic process. Under her fierce protection, the narrative was violently wrestled back into submission. The public relations machine pivoted, branding the new marriage not as a scandalous interference, but as a destined, unstoppable romance between two soulmates. The system mobilized its vast resources to bury Eric Nederlander's pain beneath glossy magazine spreads featuring the happy new couple. Behind this impenetrable corporate wall, he transitioned from an active working television star into a billionaire collector operating entirely outside the standard constraints of society. He became a living monument to extreme, sterile luxury. He was famously reported to be the very first recipient of the American Express Centurion card, the legendary black card, a symbol of infinite, unchecked purchasing power. His financial accumulation continued completely uninterrupted, highlighted by an astonishing personal income of $261 million in the year 2004 alone. His consumption habits reflected the profound psychological detachment of a man who no longer needed to interact with the messy, unpredictable nature of regular human beings. He developed an obsessive compulsion for hoarding immaculate objects. He amassed a private collection of over 500 pairs of pristine, identically white sneakers, an obsession with cleanliness and uniformity that bordered on the clinical. Objects, unlike vastly younger partners or rival Broadway producers, do not possess complicated emotions. Objects do not age out of utility. Objects do not leak stories to the press. They simply sit quietly, existing solely to be possessed and admired, perfectly fulfilling his desperate need for absolute environmental control. This psychological need for sterile domination reached its absolute zenith in his automotive collection. His consumption went beyond simple purchases, transforming into a hoarding of automotive history. He amassed a secret climate-controlled fleet of over 150 high-performance vehicles, including a staggering 46 vintage Porsches. This was not a hobby. It was the creation of a private mechanical kingdom where he served as the undisputed sovereign. These machines, stored in secret facilities across the country, represented the ultimate triumph of capital over consequence. A single weekend in March of 2016 reveals the sheer scale of this private mechanical kingdom. He casually consigned just 17 of his vintage Porsches to the Gooding and Company auction at Amelia Island. Over a few hours of bidding, this minor fraction of his total collection generated over $22 million in revenue. He stood on the auction block, smiling warmly at the wealthy bidders, a man completely insulated from the economic and moral realities governing the rest of the planet. He had successfully built a fortress of wealth so massive that it possessed its own gravitational pull, bending the truth and rewriting history to perfectly suit his preferences. While the architect of this extreme power imbalance was busy counting his millions and curating his fleet of German sports cars, Shoshana Lonstein was left to silently navigate the desolate wasteland he had left behind. The contrast between their post-breakup realities is the most damning indictment of the Hollywood power structure. She did not possess a sister to manage her public image. She did not possess a television network to strong-arm the press. She possessed only the deep, lingering psychological burden of an interrupted adolescence. Upon fleeing the Los Angeles bubble in 1997, she immediately recognized the necessity of complete media withdrawal. She understood that any attempt to publicly defend herself or tell her side of the story would instantly trigger a devastating retaliatory strike from his PR mercenaries. She chose the grueling, silent path of survival. She returned to the University of California, Los Angeles, quietly completing her bachelor's degree in history and art history under the heavy, lingering shadow of her tabloid infamy. She then returned to New York City seeking refuge in the anonymity of Manhattan, attempting to wash off the degrading label that the media had permanently burned into her public identity. Her eventual reclamation of her autonomy was an act of quiet, profound resilience. In 1998, refusing to be permanently defined as the disposable accessory of a famous man, she founded her own independent apparel company. The launch of her eponymous clothing line was not merely a business venture. It was a psychological exorcism. For 4 years, her physical appearance, her wardrobe, and her body had been aggressively commodified and scrutinized by the male gaze of the paparazzi and the entertainment press. By becoming a designer, she took active control of the narrative. She began designing clothes specifically tailored to fit and empower the female form, reclaiming the very image that had been so ruthlessly scrutinized. She built a highly successful multi-million-dollar brand through sheer determination and a refusal to be crushed by the machinery that had attempted to consume her. She eventually married, started a family, and meticulously constructed a fragile, heavily guarded peace far away from the blinding flashbulbs of the celebrity industrial complex. She survived the meat grinder, but she carried the permanent, invisible weight of a youth that was fundamentally overshadowed for the amusement of a powerful man. The legacy of this chapter serves as an X-ray of the American entertainment complex. Jerry Seinfeld operates as the flawless avatar of network television untouchability, proving that massive corporate profit often voids basic accountability. Shoshana Lonstein represents the lineage of young women lured into the orbit of powerful men, scrutinized by a complicit press and expected to remain silent. The survival of his spotless public reputation highlights a systemic hypocrisy, deploying armies of lawyers to protect a billionaire's exploitation of leverage. This system of protection did not die with the 90s. It adapted. Today, entertainment billionaires still deploy vast wealth to manipulate digital narratives and purchase silence. The core rules of power remain entirely unchanged. The gilded cage has simply been upgraded with stronger, invisible digital bars. And sitting comfortably at the center of it all remains the undisputed king of sitcoms, a man who built a billion-dollar empire on clean, observational humor about missing socks and cereal boxes, while successfully obscuring a trail of staggering ethical compromises. The collective laughter of an entire nation provided the ultimate impenetrable cover. In the end, the greatest trick he ever performed was not creating a historic television show about nothing. It was leveraging his immense power to ensure the world looked away from everything else.